When our oldest son, Samuel, was a toddler, we lived actually over in Hillcrest, and we lived very close within walking distance to a park. And that park we went to often, as you might expect. Now, the path to that park went through a series of pine trees, a very small grove of pine trees, but we would walk through that series of pine trees to get to the park and get to a really great playground that was there. And one day, and I think it must have been quite a windy day, or maybe it had been stormy the night before, all the pine trees had dropped their nettles all over the path. And so we're marching towards this playground, and then Samuel just stops, right? He's quite little at the time, and he bends over and he starts sweeping pine needles off the path, right? Now, there's a lot of pine needles there. Samuel's always been a bit optimistic, so he's sweeping these off. And I said, mate, what are you doing? I said, the playground is right there. He says, mess. And he just keeps sweeping it. He does this for a period of time. And eventually, I managed to coax him into going to the playground, but it was really hard work to get him away from cleaning up this mess, as he saw it, of pine needles. Now, that's a very cute story to tell about a toddler, but it's a lot less cute when we realise it actually is a metaphor for the state of the world at the moment. We live in a society that is convinced, and probably is right, that it is busier than it's ever been, exhausted, tired, worn out by life, so busy that it can't look up and see the opportunity to rest, the opportunity to play. And it's got to the point that it's so bad now that they're referring to it as the rest epidemic. The inability for us to rest. Even when we have downtime, we don't rest. And I find that incredibly sad that we live in a world like that. And in particular, there's been a lot of initiatives over the last few years around this area of rest. And there was a whole thing a few years ago about sleep, right? Let's get 8 hours of sleep because that's going to fix everything. Now, who loves their sleep here? Hands up if you love your sleep. A few of you do. I love my sleep. But I got to tell you that 8 hours of sleep doesn't seem to be doing it for people. It's not enough. People still feel exhausted. And so then we start to get some research into this. And there was a lady by the name of Dr. Sandra Dalton-Smith. She's actually a Christian who wrote this book called The 7 Types of Rest. And in that book, she explained that actually the problem with just trying to get good sleep is it's not enough, right? Because there are different ways that you get exhausted. And she uses a really interesting example where she talks about the difference between what she calls mental rest and sensory rest, right? And the idea is that mental rest is all your thinking, right? And so you do all this thinking all day, potentially. You do a lot of thinking during the day. And then you come home and you binge watch Netflix, or you doom scroll on your phone, or you do something else that's screen-based. And she says, well, that's really interesting that you do that because it may help you with your mental rest. In other words, you're not thinking anymore. But what it does is continue to make you feel exhausted. Your senses feel exhausted. And so you end up actually being really tired. And so there's this, effort and of people trying to work out how can we get to a place of balance? How can we get to a place of better rest? And we're going to talk about that today. Now, the passage we're going to go through today is in Hebrews 4, so we won't go there just yet, but feel free to turn to that if you've got your Bible with you. We're going to go to Hebrews 4, but it's really important that we think a bit about what Roger talked about last week, because that's the lead-in to what we're going to talk about this week. Now, in particular, Hebrews 4, although it's all about Jesus and what he's done, Jesus is not mentioned at all in Hebrews 4. So it's really important that we go back to get the context, because as Roger was telling us last week, the context is that Jesus is like a much better version of Moses, right? And so Moses, of course, for those of you who've been following along, would know that Moses was responsible for leading the people of Israel out of Egypt. And he'd led them through the desert, and then he led them right to the place where God promised, this is going to be your new home. And that's why they left Egypt, to go to this new home. Now, what's just really sad is they get to the doorstep of their new home and they refuse to go in. They refuse to go into the new home. And this is quite amazing to me because, of course, God has brought them out of Egypt, which was probably the world's only superpower at the time, and he did it all by himself. He delivers them from Egypt, defeats the armies of Egypt, brings them out into the desert, leads this massive army of people through the desert, brings them right to the doorstep of the land that he promised them, and they refuse to go in because they don't trust him. Now, we can look at that and say, well, that sounds absurd. Look at what they've seen. They've seen God do miracles. They've seen God move and drive things forward and done all this stuff without them. And now they're saying, actually, no, sorry, God, we think this is too hard for you. That is genuinely what they're saying. We think this is too hard for you. And we can look at that and go, that sounds absurd. Why on earth would they believe that? And then we get a little bit uncomfortable when the question gets turned back on us. Do we believe you can deliver your promises to us? And particularly this promise of rest. Or do we actually think that we're never going to be able to enter that rest? We ourselves are going to be exhausted and tired. We can look at the Israelites and say, those silly people, but we look at ourselves and say, we're never going to get there. And that's the context that we start with in this passage this morning. So Hebrews 4, verse 1. God's promise of entering his rest still stands, so we ought to tremble with fear that some of you might fail to experience it. For this good news that God has prepared this rest has been announced to us just as it was to them. But it did them no good because they didn't share the faith of those who listened to God. For only we who believe can enter his rest. As for the others, God said, in my anger I took an oath. They will never enter my place of rest. Even though this rest has been ready since he made the world, we know it is ready because the place in the scriptures where it mentions the seventh day. On the seventh day, God rested from all his work. But in the other passage, God said, they will never enter my rest, my place of rest. All right, so first up, let's try and understand what's going on here. What is this rest? Now, we start off with this good news. This good news is that God has promised that we can enter his rest. And we go, that's good news. And then I reflected on that and I asked myself the question, is it? Is it good news that God has made this promise? Now, you might all think, of course it is, Mark. Of course, I'm so tired. I desperately need rest. But here's what I note about myself, and maybe some of you can relate to this. I really like to work. And maybe most of you go, no, that's ridiculous, Mark. None of us think that. But what I mean by that, not necessarily is I like to show up on a Monday morning at 8 o'clock and leave at 5 and work really hard in the meantime. But I really like to do things that make me look good and help me feel in control. I love that. I love being in control. I love it when people pat me on the back and say, well done, Mark. I really enjoy that. And I suspect I have a few friends in this room who love to work, who love to do things. Now, it might not be work for you, right? It might be your garden. It might be the way you invest in your social group. It might be your creative pursuits. It might be your knowledge or your wisdom that you build up. But we love to work. And so it's hard to rest when you get so much identity from what you do. But that's the invitation. The Israelites thought the promised land was the whole promise. That's what they thought rest was. We'll get to go to a place where we have our own space, no enemies, we don't have to deal with those struggles anymore. But the promised land was always more than just the land. And for us, the promise that God makes is more than just about the blessings we think we get out of that. It's about something much, much deeper. Now, he then goes on, the writer to the Hebrews, he then goes on to talk about this idea of God resting. And you think, what on earth is that on about? So, if you remember in Genesis, I'll start at Genesis. God spends 6 days creating the world, and then on the seventh day, it says God rested. Now, actually, each of the first 6 days, it's said that there's morning and evening. In other words, they're proper days. And then on the seventh day, it doesn't say that. And that's really interesting, right? So firstly, that God rested, and this idea that God gets tired is not really the idea here. And then that day is not bounded. It's not ended like every other day. And so the idea here, and this is very much what the Hebrews understood, is that God has been in a state of rest ever since the end of that 6th day. And the thing that is finished, the thing that he's done, is he has finished creation. It's done. Now, that doesn't mean that God doesn't work in our world. What it means is he's done with creation. And so when the writer to the Hebrews says this rest that I invite you into is like that rest that God experiences, what he's saying is something is done. Something is finished. There's something that you will never have to worry about again. And that something is the fact that Jesus has died to bring you to his Father. Salvation is a done thing. Now, we're going to talk about how we enter that rest, but the reality is there is no more for you to do. There is no other price for you to pay to enjoy what Jesus has done. It is done. And so the invitation for us all is to enter that rest. Now, he says something here about not fearing. Or it says actually that we should fear. And often we're told we should not fear. And so this is a really strange idea to us, that all of a sudden we're told to fear something. But this fear is not a fear that we'll get something wrong, that we'll stuff up. This fear is that we will miss out on something that God is handing us. It's a fear of missing out on something that God is serving up to us on a silver platter. And he's saying, take rest. Take it. The salvation work is done. Take the rest. Why wouldn't we take it? Now the writer continues in verse 6. So God's rest is there for people to enter. But those who first heard this good news failed to enter because they disobeyed God. So God set another time for entering his rest, and that time is today. God announced this through David much later in the words already quoted. Today, when you hear his voice, don't harden your hearts. Now, if Joshua had succeeded in giving them rest, God would not have spoken about another day of rest still to come. So there is a special rest still waiting for the people of God. For all who have entered into God's rest have rested from their labours, just as God did after creating the world. So here it is. We're offered this rest. Come. There's nothing more for you to do except this rest. And we're offered to come in, to enter into that rest. Much like the Israelites were invited to come into the land and they rejected it. Eventually they did come back to the land after 40 years. 40 years they came back into the land. And this time they decided to take it. But then the writer to Hebrews quotes David, Psalm 95, that says, actually, you still haven't entered the rest. Now, what's going on there? Because the Israelites thought the rest was about the land. But actually, the rest was something much deeper than that. It was about a relationship. And so they attained the land, but they missed out on the relationship. And I find that really challenging in my own life. This idea that I might get all the blessings of God, but not actually enjoy the relationship. That I might get all the good things he has to offer, but not the best thing, which is himself. Remember, we said that God had entered rest, a rest that he's never come out of. So when we're invited into rest, we're invited into relationship with him. That's the offer. Now, the writer uses this term disobey. And when we see that term disobey, we often think that what we're talking about here is there's some rule that's been broken, right? When we think about disobey, there's a set of rules, you've broken one. When my kids were little, we tried to keep the rules relatively simple, so it was really clear, right? This is what you should do, this is what you shouldn't do. And so when they broke it, it was really clear. They usually didn't have a disagreement. You know, we didn't have a lot of rules, but the rules we had were really, really clear. But when the Bible talks about disobedience, it's less about rules and more about doing things that don't align with the nature, character, and promises of God. In other words, it's not about a set of rules. It's about a God that you know and you choose to do something different than what he's on about, than who he is, than what he's promised. And that's exactly what happened here. The whole journey out of Israel, they were invited to one day be in this land of Canaan. They were invited into that. They knew the whole journey. They'd seen God do stuff. And yet, at the critical moment, they disobeyed. They did something that was not in alignment with who God was. And we're in danger of that too. We're in danger of missing God's rest because we choose to do things that are not in alignment with who he is, right? We're invited to come into this rest and we choose not to. We choose to stay busy. We choose to try and earn our way to God. We choose to be religious. And God's saying, no, that's actually disobedience. That's not just you've got it wrong, that's disobedience. Because Jesus has already done that work. Why are you trying to do that work? In fact, Jesus did it much better than you could ever do it. Stop. Stop doing that. Now, there's a couple of reasons that's really important, right? One of them is it allows us to enter into rest, right? But I want to say something else here that I think is really, really critical. The level to which we choose to let what Jesus done be enough is the level to which people will look into our lives and see us experience rest and know that there's something legitimate about Jesus. Does that make sense? The level to which we rest is the level to which people's view of Jesus is elevated. Because I've just said this whole world does not know how to rest. They have no answers. If they see us enter rest, if they see us in a place where we are at peace, enjoying our Saviour because of what he's done, there is nothing more radical we can do than do that. If you want to know how to reach your friends and family for Jesus, let me tell you this. The best thing you can start with is learn how to rest well. Learn how to rest in Jesus. Now, there's a little bit of an idea here of something that's happening now and then something that's happening in the future. So we can enter into rest today. We can enjoy rest now. But there's also a scenario in which there's a future rest. There's a rest where we're no longer living here on earth and we go to be with God. And so both are possible. This is not just about the future, it's about the now. And the illustration that is often quite helpful is this whole idea of engagement for marriage. So my son Caleb just recently got engaged, very exciting, to a girl we adore. So that's also very, very exciting. And they are now engaged, and they get treated a bit differently. When they talk about wedding planning and when they talk to people about where they're going, they get treated differently because there are benefits to being engaged. And that's the offer, the same offer we get from a rest perspective. There are benefits that, yes, will be even greater later on, but there are benefits we get to enjoy right now. So let's finish up with this idea of what it means to prioritise rest. So let us do our best to enter that rest. That's verse 11. But if we disobey God, as the people of Israel did, we will fall. For the word of God is alive and powerful. It is sharper than the sharpest two-edged sword, cutting between soul and spirit, between joint and marrow. It exposes our innermost thoughts and desires. Nothing in all creation is hidden from God. Everything is naked and exposed before his eyes, and he is the one to whom we are accountable. Now, we're told to do our best, right? I thought, Mark, you said this wasn't about effort, and it's not, but it is about choice. It is about choice. It is about priorities. We're asked to make this a priority. Because if we don't make it a priority, if it becomes that thing that we do one day, I can guarantee you we'll never get there. We'll never get to the place where we enter that rest and really get to enjoy it. Now, I use the term enjoy, but what you'll notice is that in that place of rest that we get invited into, God is doing work on us, right? So I said that there's no work that we have to do in rest, but God is working in us. And what's he doing? He's surfacing things in us. He's showing us things about ourselves, things, honestly, that God knows. Like, God's not surprised, like, oh, surprise, you got this going on in your life. But he's showing us things, some things that we don't know, some things that I would go so far as to say might shock or surprise us about ourselves. Why is he doing that? Why, when we finally enter this place of rest, is he doing that? I love being married. I really do. I'm married to Noelle, of course, so of course I do. And one of the things I love about being married is being known. When things are hard, when I'm going through challenges, when I've got some weaknesses in my life, I know I can talk to Noelle about those things. And that honestly makes me feel safe. Makes me feel I'm in a place of rest. I might be at work and stuff is going on. I cannot necessarily deal with those work people on that because they won't get it. Because they don't know me. They're not in relationship with me like Noelle is. But the invitation for us is to have that sort of relationship with God where he knows us. And we know he knows us. And we get comfortable with that, because the more comfortable we get with God knowing us in our brokenness and our hurt and our pain, the more we'll come into his presence. He knows that the more comfortable we get, the more we will come into his presence. And therefore, the more rest we will receive. And that's our invitation this morning. And maybe this idea of rest is challenging for you. You say, yeah, but Mark, you don't understand my life. I've got so much on. I'm so busy. I don't know how to enter this rest. You know, over the last year, we've been going through some discipleship stuff with John Mark Comer on a Sunday night every now and again. And we talked about this idea of rest one week around the Sabbath. And so I committed myself to start experimenting with the Sabbath, to start experimenting with rest and just trying some stuff, trying to work out what worked and what didn't. And so my encouragement to you today is not to try and necessarily force yourself into this process of living in rest all the time, although if you can do that, bless you, you'll be so glad you did. But to try some experiments. Pick a day, pick a period of time where you can start coming to God and saying, I accept all that you've done and I choose to enter into your rest. I choose to accept all you've done. I choose to let you show me the things that are going on in my life that I need to see, and I want to get more and more comfortable in this space, God. Because once you start doing that, at least my experience so far is you want more of it. As uncomfortable as it is at times, you want more of it. I'd like to pray for you now, and I'd like you to sit. I want you to rest, physically rest. Close your eyes, if you would, please. And I'm going to pray for you. Jesus, we're so grateful for your invitation to enter rest. We come to you, we are tired. We might be tired physically, we might be tired emotionally, we might be tired relationally. But we know that at the root of all that is that we are tired spiritually. Tired of pretending like we've got it all together. Tired of striving and straining to be good enough. But Jesus, we acknowledge now that you've done the work. You've done the work. And in each one of our hearts right now, those of us who know you, we offer up our thanks. We offer up our thanks to you for the work that's already been done, for the rest that's already been prepared. And for those that don't know you, Jesus, my sense is that you would say, come and enter my rest. There's no hoops you need to jump through. No work you have to do. You just have to come. You have to choose. You have to enter. Jesus, we are so grateful you are the faithful one who is faithful even when we have been faithless. I just pray this week you will lead every one of us into your rest. In Jesus' great name, amen.